All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that's super central to, well, everything in Microsoft 365. That's the Microsoft Graph API.
It is. It's a big one.
You can think of it kind of like it's your one-stop shop to, well, access pretty much everything. You're talking SharePoint files, Teams, chats, even user info over in Entra ID.
Yeah, it's really like having the universal remote to your Microsoft cloud.
Exactly.
Right. You can control it all. The trick is, of course, knowing which buttons to press and, more importantly, what permissions each of those buttons needs. And that's what we're really diving into today.
Absolutely. And, well, we've got a great set of sources here to really wrap our heads around all this.
Yeah, we do. We pulled together some really interesting stuff.
We've got articles about, like, hands-on implementation using SharePoint, best practices when you're building those Teams apps. We'll even do a deep dive into some very specific permissions like directory.readWrite_all.
Right. That one's a bit of a tricky one, as we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. We've got guidance on how to figure out exactly which permissions you need. Sometimes that can feel like a bit of a guessing game.
It can.
We're also going to talk about some ways to, actually restrict access to mailboxes, how Graph and Teams fit together, what permissions apps like Corbett need, and how to really lock things down and protect those privileged accounts using those administrative units.
And of course, because security is always top of mind, we can't forget about keeping those Graph API tokens nice and secure.
Absolutely. That's super important. So what's our mission today? What are we trying to do with all this information?
Really, our goal is to help you make sense of Microsoft Graph API permissions. Like you said, it can get complicated, it can get confusing. We want to make it clear and manageable for you.
Yeah, cut through the jargon, find those aha moments that really help it all click.
Exactly. We want to give you those key insights without, just overwhelming you with all the technical details.
Sounds good. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
All right. So one of our sources actually gives us a very practical place to start. It's all about accessing SharePoint content using the Microsoft Graph API. So imagine this. Your team uses SharePoint and Teams, right? They create these announcements, they have help pages, that sort of thing.
Standard stuff.
Yeah, and you want to display all that in a web application. Maybe you've even got some automated workflows running using Power Automate. So the question is, how does my web app actually connect to that SharePoint content using the Graph API? Where do we even begin?
Well, this article walks us through a pretty clear process, and it really focuses on, giving your web app permission to specific SharePoint sites. Not everything, just what it needs.
Okay, I like that. So what's the first step?
First things first, you got to register your web application in Azure Active Directory, or AAD.
Gotcha. So we're giving our app like an official ID in the Microsoft Cloud.
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, it's me. I belong here.
So I imagine it gets like some credentials.
It does. You get your client ID, the app name, a secret, which is basically a password. Keep that one safe, and your overall tenant ID.
All right, so we've got our apps like ID card. What's next?
Now, with that ID card, your app has to ask for permission to actually use the Microsoft Graph API.
Makes sense.
And this is where we hit those two main types of permissions, delegated and application permissions.
Right. So delegated, if I remember correctly, that's when the app acts on behalf of like a signed-in user.
You got it. So it can only do what that user is allowed to do.
Gotcha. Makes sense. And then application permissions, that's the app acting on its own, like with its own identity.
Right. Regardless of whether a user is signed in or not. And for this SharePoint scenario, the key is the site selected permission.
Site selected. That sounds like it's designed to like limit access.
Exactly. This is all about least privilege. Why have keys to the whole building when you only need to get into one office, right?
Right. So instead of giving our app access to every SharePoint site, we can use site selected to say, hey, you can only see this one.
Exactly. You give it permission to just the specific sites it needs to access and nothing more.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I've selected that specific permission. What happens next?
Here's the thing. Even though your app has permission to use Graph with site selected, a SharePoint tenant administrator still needs to give the thumbs up.
Okay, so it's like a two-part approval.
Right. First, the general permission to use Graph, then specific authorization for that actual SharePoint site. And the article mentions using Graph Explorer for this.
Gotcha. So the admin logs in with their admin account, and then what?
Well, first, they need the unique ID for that specific SharePoint site, the site ID. It's like the address of that one office in the building.
Okay, so how do we get that ID?
The article shows how to do it with a simple API call to the SharePoint site itself. The response you get back will have that ID, and you got to save that.
Right, so I've got the site ID. What's the next move?
Now comes the magic. You make a specific kind of request, a POST request, to a specific spot within the Microsoft Graph API.
Okay, and what does that look like?
Something like this: https.graph.microsoft.com/f.com v1.0 sites. Site AD permissions, you see that site in there. That's where your saved ID goes.
Right, so we're plugging in that specific site's address.
Exactly. And in the body of that request, you basically say what level of access you're giving, in this case, read access, and you identify your AAD app using its client ID and name.
So this is the step that actually links the app to that specific SharePoint site with those read-only permissions.
You got it.
All right, so at this point, my web app should be able to actually see the content on that specific SharePoint site, right?
Almost there. The final piece is how your app actually requests and gets that content. The article explains that you use standard web requests.
Okay.
Now, here's the important part. You include an authorization header. Think of it like a temporary badge your app shows to prove it's allowed in. And that badge, it's called a bearer token, and you get that using your AD app's credentials.
Okay, makes sense. So kind of like proving it has permission to be there.
Exactly. And usually you'll also include headers to say you want the response in JSON format. It's just easier to work with.
Gotcha. So anything else I need to know about those headers?
Oh, actually, there's this neat trick the article mentions. A prefer header.
A prefer header. What's that all about?
So sometimes you want to filter information based on columns in SharePoint that, well, they haven't been indexed.
Not properly organized for quick searching.
Right. And normally the API might struggle with that. But this prefer header, it's like saying, hey, I know this might be a bit messy, but can you try your best to find it anyway?
So it gives you a bit of flexibility, but with a warning.
Exactly. It might not always work, but it's worth a shot if you need it.
Okay, so that gives us a really clear picture of how to, well, get at that specific SharePoint content securely using those site-level permissions with Graph. So let's zoom out a bit now and talk about some broader best practices for, using Graph permissions in general.
Okay.
And I think, especially when we're thinking about things like Teams apps, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where the principle of least privilege becomes really, really important.
It comes up a lot in these sources.
It does. It's all about only asking for the absolute minimum permissions that your app needs to do its job, nothing more.
And why is that so important?
Well, think about the people who often have the final say on what apps are allowed in an organization. Those tenant administrators.
Right.
They're much more likely to approve apps that aren't asking for, the keys to the kingdom.
Right. If I see a weather app asking for access to read all my email, I'm going to be a little suspicious.
Exactly. Over-permissioned apps, they just raise all sorts of red flags, security concerns, privacy risks. They can really damage trust.
Makes sense. So how does this least privilege idea apply to those different types of access we talked about earlier in Graph? Delegated versus application.
Right. So choosing the right type of access for the job is key here. And for Teams apps in particular, you've got resource-specific consent, or RSC, which is highlighted as a more, privacy-focused option.
Okay, RSC. I've heard of that. So how does that work?
Well, RSC permissions are all about really narrowing things down. Their scope to, the specific team, chat, or meeting where your app is installed.
So it's like giving a key that only unlocks one specific room.
Exactly. It limits the potential impact, keeps the damage contained if something goes wrong.
Okay, I like that. So RSC keeps things nice and tight. What if RSC just isn't suitable for my Teams app, though?
Then you're likely looking at those delegated or application permissions again.
Right.
And remember, delegated, the app's acting on behalf of a specific user.
So limited by what that user can do.
Exactly. Now, application permissions, those are where the app's acting on its own, and that can be riskier from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, because they're granting access without a user being signed in.
Right. So the best practice is, if there's a user context available, if someone's actively using your app, go with delegated permissions.
So user present, delegate.
Exactly.
No user needed, and you need very specific tenant-wide access application, but be super careful.
Exactly. Think it through carefully.
All right. Can we talk about some concrete examples of what least privilege actually looks like in practice?
Oh, absolutely. So instead of asking for user read-write just to get basic info about a user, just ask for user read. If you only need to see names and memberships of groups but not make changes, group.read, all is enough. No need for group, read-write, all.
Okay, those are pretty clear examples.
Right, makes sense. And for managing events in Outlook, if you just need to see those events, ask for a read-only permission, not one that lets you change things. Every little bit helps.
That's a good point. So we're always looking for the most restrictive option that still lets us do what we need.
Exactly.
Now, what happens if a tenant administrator, they're doing their job, they see my app, they see the permissions, and they block one that my app needs to actually function?
Right. Good question. Well, your app shouldn't just crash and burn.
No. Okay, good.
No. The best practices here all talk about having those fallback mechanisms. So, for example, if your app can't get presence.read all to show if a user's available, maybe you just hide the presence indicator completely instead of showing status unknown.
Right, so it doesn't break. It just gracefully handles the missing functionality.
Exactly. Or if you want to, let's say, add an event to a calendar, but that calendar, read-write permission is denied, maybe you provide a direct link to their calendar with the event details pre-filled. They can then save it manually.
So the app still provides value, even with limited functionality.
That's the goal. Make it work as best as it can.
Okay, that's really smart. So building in that resilience is key. What else can we do to effectively manage permissions over time? What other advice do our sources offer?
Feature management using toggles, that's a really good one. You can turn certain features on or off based on those granted permissions. And for apps users install themselves, consider staggered permissions. Only ask for the permission when the user actually tries to use the feature that needs it.
Okay, so respecting user privacy by only asking when absolutely necessary.
Exactly. It's less overwhelming for users, and it helps build trust.
Makes sense. And what about when you release a new version of your app and it needs updated permissions? How do we keep users and their IT departments happy in that situation?
Communication is key. Try to bundle those permission changes together into less frequent releases. You don't want to bombard admins with constant requests.
Right, it gets tiring.
And when you do need to change permissions, plan ahead. Give those admins plenty of time to review and approve things.
So no surprises.
Exactly. And document everything. Explain clearly why each permission is needed and connect it back to specific features. Maybe even use visuals to show where the permission is used within your app.
So it's not just, hey, I need this permission. It's, here's what it's for, here's why it's important, and here's what happens if you don't grant it.
Precisely. Transparency is key.
Makes sense. Any final best practice thoughts?
Yes. After changing permissions, always update your publisher attestation. If what you document doesn't match what your app actually requests, well, that breaks trust. And for Teams apps, consider that Microsoft 365 certification program. It shows you're serious about security and privacy, and it can make the approval process much smoother.
All right. Excellent advice all around. Now, one of our sources, the CIPP documentation, they actually give us a concrete list of permissions that their app needs.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's their secure app model, or SAM application. So what can we learn by looking at this real-world example?
This is really useful because it shows us the kinds of permissions that, a real comprehensive management solution might actually need. It's a long list, both delegated and application permissions.
Right. And they explicitly state that removing any of these permissions, it could actually break things in their app.
It can. So it really shows how interconnected everything is. You can't just yank out a permission without potentially causing problems elsewhere.
Right. It's like a complex web. So what are some examples of the permissions that CIPP needs?
Well, on the delegated side, they need things like activity feed, read. That's for accessing all that organizational activity data.
Okay.
They also need all sites. Full control, which, as the name suggests, gives complete control over SharePoint site collections. And then various application, read and write permissions, audit log read, all to look at the logs, group.readwrite, all to manage groups, and sites.readwrite, all for those SharePoint sites.
So a lot of permissions to let them do their job.
Exactly. And remember, these delegated permissions are all about acting on behalf of a user. They can't do anything the user themselves isn't allowed to do.
Right. Makes sense. What about on the application permission side?
All right, so their application permissions include a bunch for managing Teams channels. You've got channel.create, channel.readBasic, all, channel member.readwrite all, things like that. They also need device, read-write all to handle devices in EAN. And of course, expensive group permissions, group.create, group.read all, group member.readwrite.all. And they also list sites, full control.all, and team read basic all.
Wow. So quite the extensive list.
It is, but it makes sense when you think about what they're doing, managing things across the entire tenant, often without a user being signed in. It's necessary for the kind of automation and background tasks they have.
Right. So it's a good reminder that, we need to really carefully consider what an application needs versus what might just be convenient to have. Don't just ask for everything.
Exactly. The more permissions you grant, the bigger the potential risk if something goes wrong.
Makes sense. And this brings us to a more, fundamental question.
Yeah.
When do you choose application permissions versus delegated permissions? What's the deciding factor?
Right. So delegated, it's all about your app acting on behalf of a user. Both your app and the signed-in user need to be authorized to access that specific thing. This model is great for situations with role-based access control, or you want to limit access based on individual user permissions.
Makes sense. So if I have a user actively using my app and they need to access like their own files or calendar, delegated permissions would be the way to go.
Absolutely. If the resource access can be tied to that specific user, or if the user has to be involved to access the data, go delegated. It's generally the safer option.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those situations where there isn't a user involved, like a background process or something?
Right. So in those cases, you're looking at application permissions. These are for scenarios where you need tenant-wide access, or for those background services that run without someone directly interacting with them.
So no user needed, broader access required.
But proceed with caution. Our sources really emphasize not using application permissions if you have a user context available. It's all about limiting that potential risk.
Right, because they inherently grant much broader access.
Exactly. Like, if you just need to work with the currently signed-in user's calendar, don't use an application permission to access all calendars. That's just overkill and potentially dangerous.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, before we move on, are there any built-in safeguards when it comes to application permissions? It can't be a complete free-for-all, right?
Oh, thankfully not. For most application permissions, you actually need a global administrator to explicitly grant admin consent.
Okay, so that provides an important layer of oversight.
It does. It keeps things in check.
Yeah.
One of our sources also points out a little quirk with Power Automate. The built-in HTTP action there, it doesn't always play nicely with the caching of user credentials needed for delegated permissions.
Oh, that sounds like it could be a headache.
It can be. They suggest using custom connectors within Power Automate as a better workaround.
Okay, good to know. So shifting gears a bit, one of our articles highlights something pretty surprising about a specific permission. Directory.readWriteAll.
Yeah, that was a bit of a head-scratcher.
It is,
Yeah.
because the name kind of implies it's, all-powerful. But it turns out that's not entirely true.
Not at all. One of our sources did some testing, and they found that even with both directory.readwrite.all and application.readwrite.all, they couldn't even do something seemingly basic, like adding a new owner to a service principal.
Wait, really? So even with all in the name, there are limitations?
There are, and it's not just that one specific task. It goes deeper. So if you've got an app with directory.readwrite.all, here's what it can't do. It can't promote itself or any other principal to global administrator.
Okay, that makes sense. That's a pretty sensitive one.
It is. It also can't grant itself other Graph app roles, can't reset passwords, can't add new credentials to applications or service principals.
So no managing keys and secrets?
No. And it can't manage the owners of those applications and service principals either, and it can't manage the members or owners of those role-assignable security groups.
That's a surprisingly limited scope for something called directory.readwrite.all. So if it's not the ultimate key, what built-in role is it actually equivalent to?
From what we've seen, it looks more like the built-in groups administrator role. Definitely not global administrator, despite what the name might lead you to believe.
This is really important info. So if directory.readWriteAll isn't the be-all, end-all, which specific app roles should security pros be really worried about? Which ones could lead to, unintended privilege escalation?
Two big ones: role management.readwrite.directory and uprole assignment, readwrite.all. The first one, that lets a service principal promote anything in the directory to any role, including global admin. Scary stuff.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And the second one, that's even more potent. It lets a service principal give itself or anyone else any Graph app role, and it completely bypasses admin consent.
Wow, that's like a backdoor to everything.
It is. So those are the real keys to the kingdom. But you also want to keep an eye on application readwrite.all. That one lets an application add new credentials and owners to existing applications and service principals. And then group.readwrite.all and groupmember.readwrite.all. Those are important because they control non-role assignable groups. And lastly, service principal endpoint.readwrite.all. That one lets you add new credentials to existing service principals.
So a lot of potential for, unintended consequences if these are granted too freely.
Exactly. Don't just rely on the name of the permission. Really dig in and understand what it actually lets you do.
Okay, good advice.
Yeah.
Now, with all this complexity, how do we even start figuring out which permissions we actually need for our apps? It can't just be guesswork, right?
No, definitely not. Especially if you're moving from like the older Azure AD PowerShell to the more granular Graph SDK. Guessing and over-permissioning is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, too risky.
One of our sources recommends starting with Graph Explorer. When you run a query there, it shows you the minimum permissions needed for that specific query. But remember, always choose the least privileged option.
Okay, so Graph Explorer gives us a good interactive starting point. What about when we're writing scripts, automating tasks? We can't always use a graphical tool.
Right, so when you're scripting, read that official Graph API documentation carefully. The documentation for each endpoint lists both delegated and application permissions you need.
All right, documentation is our friend.
It is, and the Graph PowerShell SDK has two really handy CMDlets. Find McGraph permission and find McGraph command. The first one lets you search for permissions based on actions or keywords.
Okay, so I can search for group management or something.
Exactly. And the second CMDlet, that finds the PowerShell CMDlets for specific objects, and it shows you the required permissions. Even separates them for v1.0 and beta endpoints.
Wow, that sounds incredibly useful. Any examples of how these work in practice?
Sure. Say you want to know about managing organization-level stuff. Just run Find McGraph Permission Organization in PowerShell.
Okay, and it spits out all the relevant permissions.
Exactly. Names, descriptions, whether they're delegated or application. And for managing, say, AA groups, use Find McGraph command with the URI for groups. Find a graph command URI groups ID.
And that shows me all the smillets I can use to manage groups, plus their permissions.
You got it. Much better than just guessing.
It is. So once I've found the right permissions, how do I actually grant them in my scripts?
When you use the Connect McGraph CMDlet to connect to Graph in your scripts, there is a parameter called nmar_scope. This is where you specify the permissions your script needs.
Gotcha.
So you might have a variable like required scopes, organization.readwrite.all, directory.all, and then use that when you connect MIME graph scope required scopes.
Okay, so I define my needed scopes and pass them in.
Right. And if you're in an interactive session and the Graph PowerShell service principal doesn't already have consent for those permissions, you'll be prompted to grant them.
Makes sense. And it's also worth mentioning that Graph PowerShell service principal can end up with a lot of permissions over time, right?
It can. As you use different CMDlets, it just keeps accumulating them, so it's good practice to clean up regularly and remove any that aren't needed anymore.
Okay, good security hygiene.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about restricting Graph API access to mailboxes. Why is this so important from a security standpoint?
Yeah, that sounds like a sensitive area.
It is. Over-permissioned apps with the mail. Send permission, for example. Those can be a real nightmare if they get compromised.
Right, because an attacker could send emails on behalf of anyone.
Exactly. Phishing attacks, malware, all sorts of bad stuff. And the AD portal doesn't give us a lot of granular control over this, unfortunately.
Okay, so limited controls. How do we even know which apps have this permission then?
A couple of ways. You can use a tool like the eNow App Governance Accelerator. It has a report that shows you all the API permissions granted to apps in your tenant.
Okay, so I can filter for apps with mail. Send.
Exactly. Or you can use a PowerShell script. One of our articles actually includes a sample script for this.
Nice.
It goes through all your registered apps and lists their graph permissions. Really helpful for getting a quick overview.
Awesome. And beyond just identifying them, what can we actually do to restrict this mailbox access?
The ideal solution is application access policies. These let you restrict an app's access to specific mailboxes rather than giving it free rein across the entire tenant.
Okay, so very specific control over who can send what from where.
Exactly. It's the best way to really enforce least privilege for mailbox access. And you can also use the Graph API activity logs.
Those aren't enabled by default though, right?
No, you have to configure them in AAD to send their data to a log analytics workspace.
Gotcha.
But once you've done that, you can run queries against those logs to see when apps use the SendMail endpoint.
So I can see which apps are actually sending email and potentially even which email addresses are involved.
You got it. It gives you that extra layer of visibility.
Okay, that's really useful information. So let's switch gears again and talk about Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Teams. What kind of productivity benefits does this integration offer?
Oh, this is a big one. Integrating Graph with Teams, it's like a productivity supercharger. It gives you this single, unified way to access data across all of M365, which opens up a ton of possibilities for automation.
So I'm thinking like automatically creating new teams, managing channels, provisioning users.
Exactly. All that tedious stuff becomes much easier. And you can build custom Teams apps that integrate seamlessly with other M365 services. That means real-time data syncing and awesome insights into team collaboration.
So it's not just for admins. Developers can really take advantage of this too.
Absolutely. It unlocks a whole new world of possibilities for building powerful and integrated Teams experiences.
Okay, now security is always a top priority. What are the main things organizations need to keep in mind when they're integrating Graph with Teams?
Well, the foundation of it all is the Microsoft Identity Platform. It's like the gatekeeper, handling all the app registration, access tokens, and permission checks.
Right, so it's the security backbone.
Exactly. And the underlying tech here is Oath 2.0 and OpenID Connect. Oath handles authorization. Think of it like giving your app a VIP pass to access resources. And OpenID Connect, that's all about verifying the user's identity.
So making sure it's actually who they say they are.
Right. And of course, that principle of least privilege applies here too. Only request the absolute minimum permissions your app needs to work. And remember those different types of permissions, delegated versus application.
Right, delegated for user-specific actions, the application for background tasks.
Exactly. Choose the right one for the job. Now, if you want to manage teams programmatically using Graph, you can use those REST API calls.
Okay, so specific endpoints for specific actions.
Right. For example, teams to create and manage teams, channels for channels within those teams, and chat message to send messages.
So I could write a script that automatically creates a new team with specific channels and then posts a welcome message.
You could. And for real-time interactions, you've got change notifications and webhooks.
Okay, so I can get notified when something happens, like a new message or a change in team membership.
Exactly. And you can manage users and their roles, too. Add new members, update roles, remove members, all that using the team's team members endpoint. But again, stick to least privilege. For work and school accounts, teammember.readwrite all is usually enough for managing membership.
Okay, so no need for those broader, more risky permissions. Now, what about templates for setting up teams? Our sources mentioned those. How does Graph fit in there?
Graph lets you programmatically create teams based on templates. You can do this in the Teams Admin Center or with tools like Enbold, but Graph really shines when you need to automate things at scale.
So if I need to create 100 new teams with the same basic structure, I can use Graph to do that quickly and consistently.
Exactly, and you can even specify a template to use and then provide details like the new team's name and description.
Very efficient. Now, before you wrap up, what about security and compliance when it comes to Graph and Teams?
Always implement single sign-on, or SSO. It's better for users and it's more secure. Always follow least privilege, review those granted permissions regularly, and make sure you're compliant with your organization's policies.
So things like multi-factor authentication, using dedicated service accounts, enabling auditing, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process of monitoring and adapting your security posture.
All right, excellent points. Now, let's talk about a specific app we mentioned before, Corbett. Our sources tell us about the Graph permissions it needs to integrate with AD. What's the absolute minimum permission Corbett needs?
According to the Corbett knowledge base, the minimum application level permission is group read all.
Group.read.
Sure.
Okay, and they specifically say delegated access isn't enough, right?
Right. It has to be application level.
Okay. Now, that seems like a pretty narrow permission scope. What does that actually let Corbett do in our AD environment?
Well, it basically lets Corbett see the groups that exist in your Azure AD. It can get information about those groups, their names, descriptions, members, things like that.